Through this series of short videos, we are going to explore 12 signs of the end times that are documented throughout the Bible. Indeed, these signs are troublesome, but fear not, Christ overcame the world. I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus, speaking to his disciples about the signs of his coming and the end of the age, declares this in Matthew 24:12. Because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. The Bible tells us lawlessness is the violation of God's commandments, as we read in 1 John 3:4. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. Sin will be so rampant and so commonplace in the last days that the love people once had for one another, for many, will be non-existent. In this prophecy, Jesus Christ is describing an ongoing breakdown in the relationship with God. And since people's love for God is waning, it will be evident in the way people treat one another as well. A symptom may be that the love toward other people is decreasing, but the real cause is that the relationship with God is cooling off. This is what we are witnessing in our world today.
The outpouring of grief and anger is once again happening here in America, following two mass shootings and multiple acts of random crime, resulting in the loss of innocent lives. However, what makes the last 2 weeks' crime sprees different from other weeks is that for the first time, almost every demographic is represented, not only as victims, but also as perpetrators. You know, acts of violence have been plaguing the U.S. all in the month of March. RT correspondent Natasha Sweet walks us through these recent horrifying events.
From lethal carjackings to mass shootings, violence is on the rise in the U.S. It all comes as we inch our way closer out of the pandemic. But these events are far from what we can even consider to be normal.
Take a look at this video where an Uber Eats driver hangs on for dear life in his vehicle while it's being stolen in D.C. last Tuesday. The car crashes, killing 66-year-old Muhammad Anwar. Police say two girls aged 13 and 15 assaulted the victim with a taser while attempting to steal the vehicle. The two were arrested and are being charged with felony murder and armed carjacking. Both have pleaded not involved, the juvenile equivalent of not guilty. Their next court hearing is scheduled for Wednesday. 4 teenage boys also arrested for other armed carjackings in D.C. just days later. On Saturday, local police arrested two 13-year-old boys for 2 armed carjackings happening less than 2 hours apart. Later in the week, 2 other boys, ages 13 and 14, were also arrested in D.C. for an armed carjacking. In Henrico County, Virginia, a 13-year-old 8th grader was shot and killed while walking home from school with a friend by a 14-year-old boy last Friday. Authorities say the victim, Lucia Bremer, nor her friend knew the suspect. The juvenile was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and possession of a firearm. Prosecutors say he may be tried as an adult. Then in Boulder, Colorado last Monday, a grocery store shooting took the lives of 10 people, including 1 officer. 58 minutes of terror plaguing those inside. Here you see 21-year-old Elmad Alyssa being escorted out of the scene in handcuffs. Authorities say Alyssa carried a rifle type of firearm and a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. His defense lawyer asked for a mental health assessment. He remains held without bail on 10 charges of first-degree murder. On March 16th, 3 Asian massage parlors in the Atlanta area were targets of a shooting reportedly carried out by the same suspect.
Police, fire, or an ambulance?
I don't know. We need like robbery. We need a robbery here. That guy. That's why we need a police. You know.
That was the 911 call released by Atlanta police when an employee of Golden Spa was hiding from 21-year-old Robert Long. Long reportedly killed at least 8 people at 3 different massage parlors. Long claimed he had a sex addiction and apparently lashed out at what he saw as sources of temptation.
Around the world, economies are crumbling. Since the coronavirus outbreak, the price of every vital commodity has fallen.
We're seeing a lot of these markets hit.
Coronavirus has oil below $50 a barrel. U.S. demand in China has dropped off substantially.
You're impacting the demand for copper, iron ore, even gold is going down.
America's Department of Labor has recorded the highest ever number of new unemployment claims in the past 2 weeks, just under 10 million.
Governments had modelled the impact of a pandemic on their economies, but were in no way prepared. The indication is that economic activity has been sledgehammered in the course of a couple of weeks.
Just how deep is the crisis for the world economy? Over the past 2 months, the world's biggest stock markets have turned red.
It falls like that because investors suddenly have to recalculate the future for the economy and the future for corporate profits and adjust their figures sharply downwards. And then they tend to sell assets which are the most liquid. Often those are the big companies in the S&P 500. The S&P 500 had its quickest bear market decline in history.
When the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, it took almost 2 years for the S&P 500 to drop by 49%. The 2007 to 2009 financial crisis led to a fall of almost 60% in just over a year. The coronavirus pandemic has already seen the market fall by a third in just 1 month.
This crash has been so quick because it was such a shock. In the financial crisis, there was actually quite a long lead up. It was a good long 18 months of bad news. But this is genuinely a deus ex machina, a bolt from the blue, where investors were just not pricing in the risk of a pandemic. And of course, governments have never in the past imposed the kind of lockdown on a global economy that they have this time. So this was not something people had in their models.
In an effort to stop the deadly virus, businesses have been forced to close and citizens isolated at home on an unprecedented scale worldwide. It's caused a unique economic crisis, the impact of which will be greater on some industries in particular.
The industries which are hit hardest are those which are related to the consumer. So that's retailing, that's entertainment, that's hospitality, both hotels and restaurants, many of which have simply been locked down. And many of these companies will have high costs, which they'll need to keep meeting. So suddenly you have lots of costs continuing and absolutely no revenues, which is the worst possible outcome for these businesses.
But even if a business isn't directly losing out from people staying at home, lockdowns are having a devastating ripple effect. The true extent of the damage to the world economy will only start to become clear with the speed and strength of its recovery.
The big question that economists are still trying to grapple with is whether this is what they call a V-shaped recession or a U-shaped recession or an L-shaped recession.
In a V-shaped recession, the economy suffers a rapid fall but rebounds very quickly, as opposed to a longer economic trough before recovery, or long-term recession. Europeans and Americans are also being helped by unprecedented government responses.
Hasta 200.000 millones de euros.
£330 billion.
$2.2 trillion in urgently needed relief.
These short-term protections might reduce the damage the economy suffers, but this pandemic could last a long time.
So the difficult calculation for governments is trading off the lives of people who will die from the coronavirus versus the economic damage to the economy.
Year-long lockdowns would cost America and the Eurozone perhaps a third of their GDP. Models looking at America suggest that ending lockdowns would lessen that damage, but would lead to around 1 million extra deaths.
In the last 75 years since the Second World War, we've seen nothing like this. Governments have not reacted on this scale.
Fair to say you simply flooded the system with money?
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it. We did.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally, So we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money.
The life of Pete Peterson, one of our leaders, in saying, watch out for the debt, watch out for the debt. And now we're out to trillion-dollar deficits. When do they really affect America? Sooner rather than later.
Better get that money.
You can't jump into cash. Cash is trash, okay? Cash is that they're going to, because they're going to print money. What do? You get out. What do? I think that you have to have a certain amount of gold in your portfolio, or you have to have something that's hard.
Providing liquidity is a nice way of saying it. What they're doing is they're creating inflation. They're just inflating. They're monetizing government debt, and they're buying assets with the money that they create out of thin air to enable massive U.S. government spending. In fact, the U.S. government is spending more money that the Fed prints than it collects in taxes.
1 year later, that number is at $6.7 trillion. Meaning that over 40% of all U.S. dollars were printed in just the last 12 months.
Where do you put your money? What's the number one conviction trade right now for you?
Silver.
So then, because thou art lukewarm, and neither cold nor hot, I will spew thee out of my mouth. We are making this effort not to alarm you, but that you might seek truth and find the love of God offered to us through the grace and love of Jesus Christ.